Today, what to know around Metro Detroit, plus checking in on the move of one of Detroit's oldest houses. Hello and welcome to your Daily Detroit for Monday, June 22nd, 2020. I'm Jer Stays. Look, let's just get started. Overall, the state's coronavirus numbers look good, but the picture isn't all rosy. Sunday, the state reported 146 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 and 3 deaths. That brings the total number of cases to more than 61,200 and fatalities exceeding 5,800. But a key number to look at and an early warning sign is the spread rate of the virus, or RT number. If it's below 1, it's slowing down. If it's above 1, it's picking up. The state's effective reproduction rate as of this recording is now 1.11. That takes into account both confirmed and probable cases of COVID-19 and is up from a number down in the 0.8s. Now, that's to a degree expected as we've reopened large parts of the economy, and it's something to watch to see if it goes really up. But the bottom line, the virus is still out there. Of course, we're here to set you up with stuff to know, so we'll have a segment with Dr. Paul Thomas later this week about the best practices around wearing masks. The New York Times has a piece out around aerial surveillance and protesters, and Detroit is the city where the most of it happened. The federal government's Air and Marine Operations, a branch of Customs and Border Protection, deployed AS-350 helicopters and conducted 58 hours of surveillance over the city. The program is usually used to monitor the border for smuggling, trafficking, and other issues. But the technology was turned on U.S. citizens as protests happened across the nation in the wake of what happened with George Floyd. There were 15 U.S. cities where the aerial surveillance happened. The Times reports that the video was fed into a digital network managed by the federal government's Homeland Security Department that's called Big Pipe. Data from Big Pipe can be used by other federal agencies and local police departments for use in future investigations. I will put a link to the full story in the show notes. Starting today, passes are required for state parks across Michigan. Access to the parks has been free in the shadow of the pandemic to limit person-to-person contact between visitors and staff. This will include Belle Isle in Detroit as well as more than 100 parks around the state. The year-long recreation passes can be purchased when you renew your license plate for $12 or at the park gate for $17. There are higher prices for those coming from out of state. At the same time, the state is now allowing camping, overnight lodging facilities, and day-use shelters that also have been put on pause due to the pandemic. Out in Macomb County, the Macomb Daily reports that construction has begun on the long-awaited Chick-fil-A in Shelby Township. There's infrastructure work happening at Hall Road and Shaner, with city officials hoping it gets done, quote, as soon as possible, unquote. There is no firm timetable on completion. The controversial Chicken Chains Foundation has donated in the past to anti-LGBT groups and is closed on Sundays for religious reasons. However, it remains wildly popular and is one of America's fastest-growing restaurants. Macomb County is getting another Chick-fil-A at Macomb Mall, and there's no word on the progress of that project. I will put a link to all of this in the show notes. The next one files under Deals and Steals as opposed to newsworthy, but we know a lot of listeners have wanted to try this place out, so I thought I'd mention it. The Shinola Hotel in downtown Detroit reopens today, and if you're an essential worker and you're looking for a fancy stay on the cheap, I guess there's a deal for you. The hotel has a new Essential Stays for Essential Workers package with a one-night VIP experience for $99. This package includes a den room, breakfast for 2 from a menu by James Beard award-winning chef and restaurateur Andrew Carmelini, a Shinola journal, and what they're calling VIP amenities. This is normally like $300 or so if you're looking for a deal on the cheap and good with staying in a hotel right now, which I know isn't everybody, check it out. There isn't a place to book this online. You got to call them at 313-356-1401. That's 313-356-1401. Of course, I will include that info in the show notes so that you can find it if you want to try this out. A quick reminder that it's our listeners that power Daily Detroit through these economically tough times. Thanks to our most recent supporters, Emily, Ann, Robin, Majid, Vincent, and Keith. We have stickers coming and much more. Also, if you can, if it's something you can do, you can join them as a member at patreon.com/dailydetroit. We do exclusive updates there, all kinds of stuff like that. And thank you so much. Now, let's step back in time to a story that began in the 1840s. Ulysses S. Grant was probably the first great general of the modern era of warfare, and his leadership was integral to winning the Civil War for the Union. Grant, our 18th president, was one of those people who can't be understood in a tweet. He was a man of contradictions who wrestled with many of the questions of his time as he went from being a tanner to occupying the White House. He's one of the Americans who has had an impact on our nation that we still feel today. And you might not know that for a time he lived right here in Detroit. Even more, a house he lived in 1849 and was built in 1837, it still stands. It's one of the oldest buildings in the city, and it's in the process of getting another lease on life. Joining me on the line to learn more is Sandra Clark, director of the Michigan Historical Center. They work to discover, preserve, and share the stories of Michigan. So, what has been the state of the house over the last few years or decades? Because it seems like it's been kind of in media obscurity for a while.
In the 1930s, it was moved to the State Fairgrounds. And for quite a while, the Detroit Historical Society would open it at least during State Fair time to visitors. That started to fade. By the time I really started knowing anything about it, it had become another place to put things on the State Fairgrounds, but not a public building anymore. And we really got involved with it when the State Fairgrounds were closed, because at that point, our historical commission became very concerned about its potential for survival. We'd already lost the stove to fire, so those were kind of the two historic pieces on the State Fairgrounds. By that time, it had been taken care of on the exterior, but it was not a public place anymore.
So what about the Grant House called to you to get involved?
My commission and others thought it was important to get involved, but I think there is always a bit of romance and pride attached with the home of former presidents of this country. So that is somewhat of the attraction. And I think the particular person who lived there, it's an interesting situation because they don't live there for very long, and it's very early in Grant's career. I think the thing that really got me sold that we got to pay attention is a picture that we found as we were doing research of the house when Grant died. And it was draped in mourning. It had black draping, and it had, red, white, and blue on it, and Grant home. And it really said to me that the people of Detroit didn't forget that this man had lived in this house.
I was going to say, Grant is the kind of character that, for the years right after the Civil War, into his presidency and his death, he was revered by many, but times for a while changed during the turn of the century, and Grant's contributions were kind of minimized by those who kind of wanted to revise the story of the Civil War. And I don't think people realize just how important Grant was and just how his death struck the country. It was something where I recently saw photos and things of it. It was just mind-blowing. I mean, it's bigger than I think any president that I've seen celebrations for. It was something that I hadn't had connection to until I started researching before we, were going to do this conversation.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say greater than any because, of course, we had Lincoln's death. Some of us remember JFK's death. But yes, it was. He'd come back to Detroit a couple of times and spoken publicly. I think what got lost for a while to history and to the history we all learned, we learned about Grant as a great general who was instrumental to winning the Civil War for the North. We learned that he didn't graduate very high in his class at West Point. What we didn't learn was how few people that he entered West Point with even graduated. And we didn't learn about his role during Reconstruction. And he was a believer in equality, or at least a much more of a believer than many people. And so we really never honored his presidency. And in fact, he established the first national park of Yellowstone, the national park system. And he established the second national park, which just happened to be Mackinac Island.
I did not know that.
Yeah, Mackinac Island did not stay a national park, but at the time it was a national park. And it was established by Ulysses S. Grant when he was president. So, we forgot a lot or we ignored or whatever of what he did after the Civil War, and it was really important. That makes him, to me, much more interesting. I think he has a lot more to say to us in this day and age because of that large span. The other thing that I found out, like you, I've come to this gradually by little bits and pieces. He grew up in the same area as John Brown of Harper's Ferry. His father actually worked for John Brown's father.
Interesting.
So he grew up in an abolitionist family.
Well, and Grant has such a complicated backstory, especially in his early years, and part of those early years were spent in Detroit. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to the story of Grant, because he seems like the kind of person who went through a story that a lot of us do, where there are changes, there's evolutions, there's finding more about oneself as you go on, and multiple forces pulling at him. You look at, the fact is that Grant for a while did own a slave that was from his wife, but he freed that slave at a time when it was a huge personal sacrifice as far as wealth. And it was part of his journey. And then as president, he was the first one to kind of run out the first round of the KKK and actually flood them out with cavalry. A very politically controversial decision at the time that today we'd be like, of course you'd want to stand up to that. But at the time, he got pilloried in the press for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that complexity of his life makes him a very relevant person for us to be talking about at any time. I said that, it's intriguing that we have a building that was home to a president of the United States. On the other hand, our first challenge was obviously to save it and find a safe place for it to live for, we hope, many more years. But then the next challenge is to figure out exactly how we program it. Because as an institution, we're not looking to build a historic house museum and try to refurbish this like the Grants lived in it in 1849, 1850. We want to figure out a way that it can play a much bigger role in community conversation, community gathering, based in Grant's life, based on the history of Detroit that this house has survived through. For a rather small, everyday house to have survived in Detroit until now is a bit of an accomplishment.
It's a miracle knowing what I know about how many historic buildings in Detroit. And basically, once you hit 1900, the number of historic buildings in Detroit becomes, or any buildings in Detroit from that era, it just becomes slim to none. And just think that this place somehow made it through is kind of a miracle.
Yeah, and it wasn't a big, grand public structure that was making it through. I think that makes it very special, too. It is representative of something that we don't have, a lot of tangible representation of what a young Army man and his wife would live in as their first house.
I agree with you completely. So it sounds like with this is that you really want to do something that has context and depth and more than just another, place to stare at some old furniture. What is kind of your timeline and process with this? Where are things standing? Because, I've heard different dates over time. Where are things at now?
Well, we actually can say it's going to move in the next 2 months.
Oh, wow.
I think. This year, I hate to say anything with certainty, but no, it is ready to move. The foundation that it's going to go on in Eastern Market is being put up right now. So the house will move. The Michigan History Foundation is working with us to raise funds to first stabilize the house. That's always step one when you move a house. This one, to get it from point A to point B underneath all the things it needs to go under, they're actually going to cut it in two, and they'll move the second story on one truck and the first story on the other truck. So we put it back together, we stabilize it, we raise money because the foundation is helping us do that, but we are going to need to raise public-private donations to get us all the way to the finish line on this one. At the same time that we're doing that, we want to hold some community conversations that present, this is who Grant was, this is what this house is associated with it. Now, what's important to you? How do you think it might be used to the best purposes for Detroit. And we want to do that with teachers. We want to do it with the people who live around Eastern Market. We've had a lot of conversations with the Detroit Edison Public School that is right across the DeQuinder Cut from where it's going to be located. We're going to do some listening before we actually decide this is exactly what we're going to do with the interior of the house and the programming for the house. If we got that done over the next 2 years, and got it actually done and accomplished, I would be very, very happy.
Well, it sounds like things are starting to move. If people want to get involved with this project, if they want to put money into it, if they want to be part of this conversation, what can people do?
They could go to granthomedetroit.org, and that's the website for this house. It's got some history of the house. It's got some pictures. The picture at the top of the history segment of that is the house in mourning when Grant died. And it tells you how you can be part of the efforts to raise funds to take it to the next step. We want people to contribute to make this happen, but we also want to hear people's ideas of what they think is important about this house.
For sure, for sure. Sandra Clark, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
You are welcome, and thank you for your interest.
Alrighty, that'll do it for your Daily Detroit. If you have feedback, questions, or things we should cover, ideas, email me at dailydetroit@gmail.com. I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and I'll see you around Detroit with a mask on. Talk to you tomorrow.